Hey everybody, so we then return to our let's read of The Origin of Language by Eric Gans. So just to quickly recap on the last video on the ostensive, we had said that the ostensive is the pointing language. It designates an object, the ostensive's referent is immediately present, which is to say there is no past tense or future tense, while there is no linguistic person either. In a sentence, this is to say the ostensive has no shifters, and it definitely doesn't have any grammatical categories. In the ostensive, everything functionally speaking is a nominal or a noun. There are no real verbs, while there is no truth aptness to the ostensive either. It is solely concerned with the presence to the scene. It is concerned with reconstructing the scene to enjoy its conflict-deferring effects. It is an expression of desire, and it is assumed in its usage that everyone else hearing the ostensive shares your desires as well. But now we are going to discuss the imperative, the commanding language. That will be the subject of today's video, going through its intentionality structure, its dialectic, and its linguistic form. And so we'll be going through chapters 7 through to 11, and beginning with chapter 7, simply titled The Imperative. Gans briefly talks about how in linguistics as a discipline, the ostensive is not usually recognized as a distinct utterance form. Only sentences with a noun phrase and a verb phrase are seen as a fundamental form of a sentence, and anything else is seen as just simply defective. So it sees the imperative as having a defective relationship to the declarative, and the ostensive just has no syntactic status at all. And so going against this is a unique contribution of Gans. Instead, to Gans, the imperative is not defective, but is nascent. It is the necessary potential for the mature language with predication and declarative speech that we use daily. So we are reminded again of how language evolves in correspondence with its relationship to a real-life referent. The ostensive cannot be made sense of without a referent object. The declarative can do without a real-world referent, while the imperative is given in the absence of an object and is satisfied once the object is made present. The example is given with the imperative scalpel, which is short for give me the scalpel. The scalpel is outside of its referent, unlike an ostensive, and so the purpose of the imperative is to give the subject an action that then moves the object into its referent, fulfilling the imperative. Remember, the ostensive alone is actually not capable of distinguishing between verbs and nominals, and so a phrase like scalpel is impossible without the imperative. From this we can see the appearance of the object being subordinated by an action. This is kind of starting to look like a subject and a predicate, which is the characteristic of declarative speech, but we will get into that in the next video. So, an imperative, like the ostensive, may refer to communally significant objects, only with the exception that the objects are absent, and then there is this call to action to bring them into reference. The ostensive creates an imaginary scene, it creates a model of reality, as we already discussed. But here Gans goes on to discuss how this manifests itself in imperative speech, most evidently through what is called a collective imperative. So these are imperatives like kill the umpire, or down with X, or dump Trump. In rituals, there is already a collective imperative in the originary ostensive and sacred sign. So calling upon God in the originary ostensive assumes that he is already present, as if you have called on him. But the idea Gans wants to express is that the collective imperative, it's actually not a cry by a mob against some outside threat as much as it is the cry of the mob or the group intent on discharging its violence on a designated victim. So Gans returns to Girard's idea of the scapegoat as an example. But in any case, originary resentment motivated by desire founded on representation designates a victim of the group. This process generates itself in collective imperatives against undefined political authorities, like the before said, down with Trump, or when people say kill the umpire in sport. There is no direct intention of killing the person by the individual participants in the chant, but rather they are just satisfying their desires. While on the other side of the spectrum, there are public executions and things like this, where the same mechanism is exercised to just the more extreme degree, so there is this kind of spectrum. But there's this theme of there always being residual resentment left over from the originary scene, because the desires of everyone involved, they can never be fully satisfied, and it is actually this resentment that generates each layer of cultural complexity in society. So we then move on to discuss the intentionality structure of the imperative. So, unlike the ostensive, the imperative is an expression of social concern, and it breaks the symmetry the ostensive had, being equally present to all on the scene of representation. So, unlike the ostensive, the imperative can differentiate between people in such a way that I can call for a scalpel, and in this case it doesn't matter who gives it to me, but in another example, I could tell somebody to come to me, and there is now a distinction made between people. It matters what person actually comes to me. And this is the linguistic recognition of person that actually allows the imperative to address social concerns. The imperative is what makes social life and social inquiry possible, in the sense of it beginning some sort of dialogue. Think about how when you meet someone in a social setting, there is an implicit set of imperatives that you put to each other. Most of them are seemingly arbitrary. Some are etiquette-based, things that like you will act respectfully, appreciate the flow of the conversation, be emotionally present and responsive. And someone who ignores these imperatives, they leave us frustrated. They have our demands unmet, and they leave us unlikely to be friends with that person. So there are different forms of the imperative, like the collective imperative that we just talked about, as well as third and first person forms. And so we get the sense that the intentionality structure of the imperative is far more complex than the ostensive, and most of this complexity we're just not going to discuss, so it's not really necessary for the purpose of this video series. So in addition, at first, the imperative has the same linguistic substance as the ostensive, but later on it begins to vary more and more. The imperative creates an asymmetry that doesn't exist in the ostensive. When someone admits an ostensive sign, there is this assumption of shared desire in the object. We used the example before. If I yell stampede, there is the assumption you too want to run from the stampede, but in the imperative, this symmetry is now broken, because obviously by putting an imperative to you, I'm desiring you do something that you currently don't intend on doing, because if I saw you intending on it, I just wouldn't ask you, there'd be no point. So in the use of the ostensive, a speaker has linguistic presence, that is, they have a virtual presence on the scene when they utter the ostensive, but with the imperative, we now have the introduction of a time horizon by which the speaker maintains this presence until the assigned task is carried out, while with the ostensive, it was just in the moment of the utterance. There is a tense now between when I asked you to do something and when it has been done, when the object is outside the referent and when it is made inside the referent. This is the adding of past and future tense to language. This is the first example of shifters in addition to the adding of personhood within a linguistic context. So we also then take this time model within the imperative as the first mapping of language onto reality. The object and the referent in the ostensive exist simultaneously, but the imperative almost overcodes reality, to use a Deleuzian term, such that its objects are moved into the frame of reference. This is language manipulating the world around us, where the ostensive could only just point to it. So Gans moves on to remind us of how the imperative introduces a distinction between nominals and verbals that wasn't clear in the ostensive. Consider someone commanding hammer. This is a nominal or a noun, while someone commanding run is verbal. Gans clarifies that you could arrange ostensives to make the appearance of an imperative or a declarative statement. You could try to see how one could put ostensives together so they appear as some other mode of language. For instance, like somebody says, fly, crows, when observing a flight of crows. And these are two separate nominals, two different ostensives, but they're not true linguistic form. You haven't actually created a new linguistic form by just sticky taping ostensives together to try to create a new mode of language, because these are known as compound utterances, whereby each component is a complete utterance in itself. You could take apart each ostensive, and it's an ostensive, it's a legitimate mode of language in and of itself. And so in a linguistic form, the components of utterances are insufficient by themselves, and so this relationship between the elements of an utterance is known as governance, and Gans claims that it is explained on the scene of representation by an action, the imperative making governance possible by allowing the linguistic elements of an utterance to have a relationship to the hearer, and this relationship is created via the demand for action that the ostensive didn't have. The imperative requests a human performance, and then this performance makes these linguistic elements come together. So just to sum up, the imperative's requirement of human performance, of action, is what gives rise to tense, person, and governance as categories that allow for declarative sentences to later emerge and actualize these things as legitimate grammatical categories. We then move on to chapter 9, entitled Elementary Forms and Grammatical Structure, by which the declarative is shown to generate combinations of tenses, persons, governances, relations amongst nominals and verbs, and all these things that we take for granted in daily speech. Because as it turns out, these categories had their inception before declarative speech, before the most mature form of language we see day to day. And we've just demonstrated how they appear in the imperative just now. In the declarative, the relations of all these things is what we call grammar, and their failure to relate properly to each other makes declarative sentence grammatically incorrect, while on the other hand their success to relate makes them grammatically correct. While in the imperative there isn't yet full grammatical categories, but only a semblance of them, in that tenses and persons are only just extensions of linguistic presence. It is only when they are liberated from this, when they are liberated from the origin of the originary crisis through the declarative, that fully formed grammatical structures come about. And it might be worth saying that grammar refers to the temporal or spatial conditions of speech, and so as long as there is this dependency on intentions, like in the imperative and the ostensive, these categories are what germs there are of them. They cannot actually be a statement upon temporal or spatial conditions that are independent of anything. They're not yet fully grammar. So we then move on to discuss the dialectic of the imperative, and that is concerned with how the imperative and language isn't moved by instinct, but by linguistic presence. For instance, responding to an imperative with obedience is to be within the presence, while to deny or to disobey an imperative is to refuse that presence. But I will leave this out to avoid confusion and technical details that you can read the book to find out for yourself. So we then arrive at chapter 10, which is called the fundamental asymmetry of the speech situation. And here we begin to look at the contradiction between the intentions of the hearer and the speaker that occur within imperative speech. The significance, that is what is conveyed of the imperative, is mediated by the desire of the speaker. If we remember the concept of linguistic presence, the relation we have to a scene that a hearer enters into and abides by imperatives put to him or her, within this scene, the speaker is given the presumption of significance, assuming he fits the terms of appropriateness made by the community. He has to be within a framing. Consider Twitter or social media today. Gans writes about how this framing has enhanced itself even more today when someone tweets out within the confines of social appropriateness. Hearers within the scene are obliged to listen, or they could tweet and they don't meet the conditions of appropriateness and they're banned or ostracized. So here in the imperative, the speaker intends on a linguistic model, but the hearer intends on the intention of the speaker. The speaker's model of the communication situation is not complete if it exists at all, and the speaker then pours his information that he wants to communicate through a channel created by language, while the hearer's experience of this channel depends entirely on the intentional act of the speaker. Now, this chapter is very meticulous, and for our purposes, it isn't necessary to get into every detail of this formal explanation of linguistic asymmetry, but it is important to note that the speaker has a model of reality that he is communicating, while the model of the hearer intends on the model as intended by the speaker. He sees it as an expression of desire. So the thing to note is that the imperative has a listener that hears the speaker, such that he not only hears the personal utterance, but he becomes a member on the scene of representation and assumes membership in a community. It is this asymmetry of intentions that creates the possibility of dialogue for a speaker. So, moving on to chapter 11, entitled Imperative Dialogue. The most important thing to take away is where the room for and the potentiality for the declarative is made within imperative speech. In this case, we know the imperative is taken by the hearer not as a model of reality, but as an expression of desire. And so it is known by the hearer that an imperative put to him might not be fulfilled. There is a conflict over the imperative of which the hearer cannot perform to. There's like this demand that cannot be fulfilled. But this type of conflict is not yet a dialogue conflict, because there isn't actually a conflict over which person is objectively right. If we remember this asymmetry we've been talking about, only the speaker, in the case of an imperative, has a model of reality that is objective or unobjective or right or wrong. The hearer just judges their intentions. It is only the declarative where a model of reality is put back to the speaker by the hearer in a dialogue. So, when the imperative is given and the hearer cannot perform, the object can't be brought into reference, and so there is now a contradiction between not only the imperative and reality, but firstly there is a contradiction in that the scene has reached its limitations. The hearer now must communicate to the speaker of the imperative that the object isn't there. This is speech that has no reference to an object, a defining characteristic of the declarative. But it is not yet a declarative because within it is still some awaiting that is yet to make it context-free. The fact that the imperative has this awaiting quality by which the speaker awaits on an act by the hearer makes it dependent on intentionality, and so it isn't a propositional statement about the world yet. So just to recap, the imperative is put to the hearer to retrieve an object. The object is absent, and so the hearer must communicate back to the speaker the absence of the object, and this is the first germ of a model of reality being put back to the speaker from the hearer and becoming declarative. There is then a discussion on negation and the imperative. One could confuse a negative imperative as a declarative. That is the request to not do something because seemingly it has no object and it might be context-free. But a negative imperative has within it its own awaitingness that makes it not a declarative also, just like the imperative model we've discussed so far. The notion of prohibiting something is just as old as the originary sign itself to Gans, and in this way the first ostensive that we have spoken about in its deferral of appetite of desire and in indicating that its sacred referent isn't to be appropriated by the group, this can kind of just be seen as a negative imperative. The negative imperative expresses a desire not of its hearer, but of his or her action. And so an even greater asymmetry than in the positive imperative is created. It has a greater authoritarian streak to it because of normative awaiting. So this is when making a negative imperative in virtue of prohibiting something rather than asking for something, it doesn't make sense how there could be a completion of the demand put to you. How can you fulfill the request to not do something? And this is called normative awaiting. And so instead, the awaiting for fulfillment of the imperative in the negative case is just prolonged into the future indefinitely. So if a mother tells her son, don't play in the mud, there's no act that's being awaited by the mother. The imperative is just maintained until linguistic presence is ended. And so maybe a sign of renouncement could end this. The mother could then say it's okay to play in the mud in this case or something. So the speaker's desire here is identified with the maintenance of the communal scene, which is to say that negative imperatives play a large role in the continuation of a social order. The speaker giving a negative imperative with its indefinite awaiting has an authority to him or her, and is now putting not only a demand, but a norm to the hearers of the group, like don't cut in line at the store or don't defecate in public. These are negative imperatives, but the takeaway is that they are also norms. But it should be said that the negative imperative is not its own mode of speech, like the declarative or the ostensive. It is instead just a matter of content, and nor does it add any grammatical paradigms. And so Gans goes into a small discussion about this, but again, these few chapters we've looked at are extremely meticulous, and we aren't going to bother with the details of it, so instead we will end the video here. And next time, we will be looking at the origins of the declarative. And, you know, I got kind of in trouble by some people for my outros in the last videos, and so I thought I would just explain a little why I did that. So, personally, I don't really